But at that point, as you would know, the Americans started with a 48 hours deadline. Then they extended it for 5 days. Now they've extended it by another 10 days. Yes, of course, I think it's part of their strategy to degrade Iran's capacity to basically project its power in the region through its proxies or directly. And for that, a systematic bombing campaign is going on. And we've seen what they're doing. They're destroying the missile sites. They're destroying the nuclear sites. They've really degraded the Navy and Air Force and air defense. So yes, it is part of a strategy. But at the same time, I believe that it's a good time for an off-ramp. And I think that President Trump was not really very keen for a long military campaign. The Israelis probably have a greater appetite for that. So had he gotten good response from Iran, he might have ended this war earlier because he wanted some sort of a trophy or some sort of a victory that he could take back to his constituency and tell them that, okay, this is what I brought for you from this very swift and successful campaign. But since the Iranians, they also employed a high-risk strategy. Of course, they did not just attack Israel, but they also attacked the Gulf countries, the American bases, but not just the American bases, the civilian infrastructure there as well. And then, I think perhaps most importantly, they blockaded the Strait of Hormuz. So that has, in my view, forced America to stay in the war. And now, of course, when they stay in the war, they're trying to exert maximum pressure on Iran. And that is why we could see an escalation from here on. But I believe that this would not be good for the Americans. It would not be good for the Iranians. It would not be good for the Gulf countries, not good for the region where we are situated, or the broader regions. And of course, it would not be good for the world economy, which is in quite a peril right now. So I think the best course of action for everybody would be to move from this lose-lose situation to a win-win situation. And for that, diplomacy needs to be given a chance. Well, I believe, first of all, the points that we have seen emerging from both the sides, the negotiating points or the demands, so to speak, they are not really surprising because, all sides, they present their wish list. And normally they have a maximalist approach because if you don't do that, then, the negotiating table, you would have a weaker hand. So that is why we see from both sides a maximalist position entailed charter of demands, if you can say that, you can call it that. But I believe if the dialogue is instituted, then there will be flexibility from both the sides, and we will see a situation wherein there will be a lot of space for give and take. And I believe that many of these divergences could then be converted into some sort of convergences because there are overlapping interests on both sides. And I believe an agreement is possible. It would not be easy, it would be very challenging, but it's not impossible. I think Islamabad is in a unique position right now to facilitate a dialogue, to mediate a dialogue even. And why is that? Pakistan has excellent relations with Iran, brotherly ties, long-standing brotherly ties. With the US as well, we have long-standing ties of cordiality and cooperation. And the relations are in a very good phase. With the Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, we have fraternal ties, very, very close and cooperative relations. So all these countries, they trust Pakistan. There's a mutual respect. And that is why Pakistan, I believe, is in a unique position. And because you see, what is the problem here? There's a great deal of trust deficit between Iran and the US-Israeli side. because Iran believes that every time they have been asked or invited for a dialogue, invited to negotiations, and negotiations have been instituted, before they have culminated, they have been attacked. It happened in June, last June. It happened this time around as well. And that is why they are not willing to now sort of believe in the US sort of, like initiative or the US overtures, so to speak. But Pakistan can bridge that gap. Pakistan can bridge that trust deficit by putting its own credibility on the line. And that is why I believe that we have seen recently all this diplomacy where Pakistan has been a conduit. And I believe that if these negotiations will be held in Islamabad, they can be very useful, very productive. Yeah, that's very interesting. Like there are two or three things that I've been saying in my media comments since the inception of this war. One was, and that was sort of, contrary to what many of the other observers were saying, and that was that, if the Iranians would attack the GCC countries, then they would in turn put pressure on the Americans and the Israelis, because some of those countries have good relations with Israel, for instance, UAE, Bahrain, to end the war. I felt at the time that it could be counterproductive as well. It could actually work the other way around, because those countries, once they're attacked, they would then feel that the reputational damage has been already taken. And now it would be in their interest for Americans to finish their job, so to speak. And that is exactly what has been witnessed recently. That is what the media reports indicate. The second thing I had said was that, like after the first wave of these targeted assassinations, I had said that there will be another wave of targeted assassinations very soon. And we saw a second wave of targeted assassinations. Now, the third thing that I've been saying, and I've been saying it since probably the second week of this war, that we will see operations by US Special Forces. And those operations would entail what? Number one, possibly some attack on the nuclear sites, such as in Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordo, because the Americans were sort of, they were very concerned about that 450 kilograms of enriched uranium, which is enriched to about 60%. And from that to move to 90% enrichment does not take that long. It only takes some months. So that 450 kilograms of uranium, which Iranians still have, which is buried perhaps somewhere in one of those sites, or has been retrieved by the Iranians partially, that becomes critically important. Secondly, as the war progressed, I felt that these special operations could include some action along the coastline. That is along the Strait of Hormuz. And why? Because the Americans would like to damage their degrade Iranian ability or capacity to blockade the strait itself. Thirdly, I felt it was possible that some of these operations could probably hit Tehran itself. So as per recent reports, we have seen that, those troops are being moved. There are various numbers being circulated, 7,000 troops perhaps, which includes an airborne division, includes an expeditionary force, and some of the Marines. The point is, whether it's 7,000 or 10,000, as other reports indicate, these are special forces. I don't really think that they're planning a large-scale invasion, because that's not even possible. For that, you need months and months of preparation, and troop movement would require many months. What they're planning is basically special operations. Now, I think one of the operations being planned is on these Kyrgyz Islands, because that becomes so critical, because 90% of Iran's oil and gas exports are through that island, because their coastline is such that the big oil tanker cannot, they cannot pick oil from there. So that island is used, and it has a very sort of, elaborate infrastructure for that. So I think the Americans are preparing for that, but that is a plan B. If the negotiations take place, and if there is good progress in the negotiations, they would not do that. But if the negotiations fail to take off, fail to get instituted, and there's no progress, then I think in the next phase of this war, we will see those special operations taking place. And that would be a high-risk strategy, both for America and Iranians. Why for America? Because that could result in high casualties. So far, the casualties that we have seen are probably like a dozen or a dozen and a half on the American side. On the Iranian sides, of course, it's much more, mostly in terms of collateral damage. For Israelis also, we're talking about another dozen. So it's not really much in terms of such a massive conflict. But those special operations can entail many more, in fact, manifold casualties. And that could sort of, change the support of this war in the US. So far, on the Republican side, there is still support for this war. On the whole, of course, just 40% of the Americans support the war. But if we talk about the Republicans and the core constituency of President Trump, and 80 to 90% of them are supporting this war, that could weaken. From the Iranian side, so such actions, would mean what? They could, of course, that could cause many casualties as well. But more importantly, let's say if these operations succeed, that would certainly weaken Iran's hand in any future negotiations. Now we have clear indications of what happened. What happened was when they bombed those sites, and of course we would remember that they used B-2 bombers, and this was this special bombs. They are even sort of more specialized than the so-called bunker busters. These bombs were specially developed for this very purpose, and they were dropped. These sites are 200, 300 under the ground, of course, subsurface. So what happened was when they dropped the bomb, these sites sort of, on the top and probably like 100 feet down, 150 feet down, they were destroyed. But apparently the uranium, and some of the American intelligence reports has confirmed that the uranium was way below that. And the uranium is in the shape of gas. It's basically in the shape of gas, which is contained in cylinders. So that still remained intact. Now the Iranians, subsequently, the Americans, through the satellite pictures and other intelligence, they discovered that the Iranians were in recent months trying to retrieve those cylinders, because those cylinders, that gas could be solidified subsequently, and then, of course, enriched further. So, in fact, that was one of the reasons that the Americans got convinced by the Israelis that they need to take some action. So the fact is that, yes, the sites were destroyed, damaged to a great extent. But yes, the enriched uranium is still there. And then, that's why the Americans either want to seize it or they want to destroy it. And they know where it is, more or less. It is in these three sites. They believe that Iranians might have been able to retrieve some of that already and shifted it elsewhere. So that makes the task more formidable. But whatever is left there, and I think the reports indicate that for the most part, uranium, the enriched uranium is still there. They want to destroy that or seize that. Definitely, that is the trump card, so to speak, for Iran, because Strait of Hormuz, that has caused the maximum damage. It has inflicted a great deal of damage, not just for sort of the region's commerce and trade, for the Gulf countries, because, for instance, Qatar, look at Qatar. Um, they are the biggest gas exporter in the world, but they have not been able to export any gas since the war started. Similarly, UAE. UAE is totally dependent on the Strait of Hormuz almost. They have another port, which is sort of, which goes from the other side. But, because they haven't really built pipelines, so the capacity to shift sort of, the oil to them through that port is very limited. Saudis, on the other hand, because they have a pipeline which takes all the sort of, at least about 50 to 60% of the oil to ports on the Red Sea, and they could then go through Bab el Mandab to sort of, Asia and beyond. So they have, let's say, some alternative. But UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, they don't really have much of an alternative. On the other side, all the countries which are recipient of this gas and oil, for instance, Pakistan, India, South Korea, China, Japan, these are big economies. They are very badly affected. And we know what has happened to the prices of oil and gas in the world. The price of oil has almost doubled, especially, the Gulf oil is the best quality oil in the world. So it fetches the highest price in the world. The three main sort of, categories of oil: WTI, which is the Western Texas oil. Then there's the Brent crude, North Sea, and sort of, but a lot of other oils are sort of, they're categorized within that category. And the Gulf oil. The Gulf oil is by far the most expensive. But now the price has doubled to what it was before. And that has caused great economic disruption, first in terms of sort of, supply shortages, and second in terms of the doubling of the price. So yes, that is the biggest card, or the most important card that Iran holds. And Iran understands its importance. And Iran also believes that the US is desperate to end this blockade. And the problem with this blockade is that to cause this blockade or to sustain this blockade, Iran doesn't really need much. Iran's geography does the job for it. Why? Because even the threat of force is enough for a blockade. You don't even have to use force, or you have to use very little force. You just have to hit 2 or 3 ships, or rather oil tankers, and all of the oil tankers would not dare to enter the strait. And that is exactly what has happened, because then the insurance premium rises to sort of, to a level which is not sustainable for any shipping company, and the traffic stops. We know now that a couple of thousand ships, or oil tankers and ships, sort of, a mix of those, they are just waiting sort of for this blockade to end on each side of the strait. And I think that this is more than anything else, which is really hurting the region and the world economy, and putting the most pressure on the Americans to end this war. This is exactly in keeping with what I just said, my prediction at the start of the war, that Iran's strategy or tactic, whatever you call it, of sort of, attacking the Gulf countries, and hoping that they would then exert pressure on America to stop this war, may work the other way around. It could backfire. And that is exactly what has happened, as you've just said. Now, from where do we go from here? I believe that these countries, if the situation continues, then they might join this effort. Especially they would join the endeavor to unblock the Strait of Hormuz, for which America is already trying to gather an international force. And why is America trying to do that? It's not that it lacks capacity. Perhaps they can muster that capacity on their own, because the Navy all around the globe is just immense. The The thing is, what they're trying to do is if they're able to get sort of, like ships or navies of 10 or 15 countries involved in this operation, what happens then? Then Iran cannot take the risk of going to war with 10 or 15 more countries. And that would tie Iran's hands. That is what their strategy is. And I believe that America's sort of, like they have been working on it quietly and in public view as well. Initially, many countries were reluctant, particularly the European countries, to join this endeavor. But with, exerting pressure and trying to, and, through sort of, like persuasions and the fact that, like now all countries are realizing what this blockade of Strait of Hormuz could do to their economies. So I think they're coming round now one by one. And yes, the Gulf countries may join that endeavor as well. And if they join that endeavor, of course, that would be, that would be signifying that they are in some sort of a confrontation with Iran militarily. It all depends, sort of, where the things stop. There are 2 or 3 scenarios possible. One is that we see a dialogue, we see sort of, a settlement of all these lingering, or rather, sort of, like long outstanding issues. And that would be the best scenario for everybody involved. If that happens, then they will not have to worry. The second scenario is that, like this war ends in some sort of a stalemate, like where Iran sustains some of its capacity, and which it can then strengthen further, rebuild. In that case, yes, this whole thing could repeat itself again. There could be a deja vu, and I think in that case, these Gulf countries would start arming themselves in a big way. They already spend a sort of, tens of billions of dollars a year on the defense, but that could then probably double or quadruple, because then that'll become their primary concern. The third scenario, of course, could be that if this continues and the Americans and Israelis are able to degrade Iran's capacity to the extent where it is not able to pose any credible threat to the region and sort of, to those countries again, then what will happen is that those countries would become even more dependent on the US security umbrella, and we will see a strengthening of the bases there, and we will see them entering into yet greater defense cooperation agreements with America. Look, I mean, when you become a mediator or a facilitator, there's always a risk of sort of, like a risk of failure in terms of sort of, the dialogue not sort of, taking off, or sort of, both the sides kind of, like getting upset with the facilitator. Why? Because, the facilitator or the mediator has to manage the expectations, because, both the sides may feel that, okay, because we have long standing ties of cordiality and cooperation with this country. So this country, the mediator or the facilitator would look out for their interests, but a mediator or a facilitator has to be neutral. So sometimes that can create some tensions. But at the same time, I think that risk has to be taken, because if you do it sincerely, if you do it in good faith, then more often than not, the countries involved, the parties involved, they respect the fact that you cannot take sides. You have to be impartial in the negotiations, because only that way you could be an effective facilitator or mediator. So yes, there are some risks attached to that, but I think these are risks which need to be taken in this situation, because Pakistan is one of the worst affected countries because of this crisis. we are 90 to 95% dependent on Gulf oil. That is much more than any country of the world, literally. So, and of course, Iran is a neighbor with which we have over 900 kilometers of borders. So any instability in Iran can have a spillover effect for us as well. So given the fact that we enjoy this credibility, we enjoy this respect, we enjoy this trust from the parties involved, I think Pakistan and Pakistan has a track record for that. If Pakistan can play a useful role, a very constructive role, Pakistan needs to take that upon itself.